All right, welcome everybody. We're live to our first ever Kubernetes Windows office hours. This is going to be a 1 hour long live stream where we sit down with SIG Windows and the people who helped them enable Kubernetes on Windows. So the way this is going to work is we are hanging out in #SIG Windows on the Kubernetes Slack. If you're watching the live stream on YouTube, just follow the instructions that I've put in the text below, and we will be live streaming the chat over here. Actually, over here, this sidebar, you should see the Slack SIG Windows channel. You're definitely encouraged to hop on in, ask some questions for the next hour, and then hang out with the team and find out all that you need to know about this feature. However, before we begin, let's start with some introductions.
All right. Hey, I'm Patrick Lang. I work at Microsoft, but I'm one of the co-chairs here in SIG Windows. So.
Hey, Patrick. Hi, everybody. This is Michael. I work at VMware in product management. I'm also one of the co-chairs in SIG Windows as well. Thank you all for attending.
Hello, everyone. My name is Jeremy Wood. I'm an individual contributor. I'm working hard towards the GMSA portion of the Windows code.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kalia Subramanian. I work at Microsoft on the container networking team, and I mostly work on kube-proxy related changes and bringing VXLAN for Windows in Alpha.
Hi, all. This is Craig Peters. I also work for Microsoft, and I work upstream in various open source communities, making sure that we're contributing the right stuff.
All right, I think that's everybody. Okay, so let's get started. The way it works is feel free to just whack your question into the Slack channel. Just preface it with question, : so I could see it. In the meantime, while everybody gets ready and starts queuing up their questions, I'm just going to start opening. Can you all just kind of fill us in on the features in general, like what it took to get here? Like when you say Kubernetes and Windows, that can mean a lot of things. So what's the executive? You know, I'm a CTO at work. I have Windows machines. I have Kubernetes. Like how are you putting these two worlds together for me? Give me the overall kind of thing while people start to queue up their questions.
Either or. Go ahead, Patrick.
Yeah. So I think probably the first bit of background I should share on that is that Microsoft started developing Windows containers as a feature in Windows Server 2016, and that is using the same Docker tooling that's available on Linux. The only real difference there is that it's able to run a Windows app on a Windows machine. This doesn't mean you could take a Windows app and like magically run it on Linux or vice versa, but it does give you the same kind of tooling that you could build into your developer workflow. And what's really nice about that is because the same image format is shared across multiple orchestrators, Michael's team was able to start developing Kubernetes support for that early on. Do you want to talk a little bit about that, Michael?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think that, that was a tremendous benefit to be able to kind of use the same underpinning infrastructure. So being able to use the Docker API and the Docker engine to build the infrastructure on top of which you could build containers gave us a lot of benefits because we could reuse a lot of the same code and practices and tooling that Kubernetes was using. So we took a lot of that work that Microsoft created and started working on Windows and Kubernetes with a goal to allow Windows developers to bring their apps into Kubernetes and introduce worker nodes that are on Windows. So took us a little bit over 3 years to do that effort. And during that time, there were tremendous contributions that went into Windows Server with Windows Server 2019. We had a lot of the work around the host network service, which was the underpinning for creating the CNI networking plugins. And we're able now to provide our users with a full Kubernetes cluster that includes a Kubernetes master running on Linux, Linux worker nodes, as well as Windows worker nodes. So you have a heterogeneous environment where you can run all the apps that are important in your environment. Jorge, you're muted.
Sorry, I'm going to ask all the basic questions. So how does this work for the developers? Let's say I'm at work. I have a mixed team. I have some Linux folks. Like, how does it figure out where to put the stuff, right? If like my neighbor has Windows stuff, like, is there workflow differences? Are there?
There are certainly some differences. So, you know, everybody needs to understand these are different ecosystems, right? So the expectations from the Windows developers and Linux developers are a little bit different. But from a workflow standpoint, there isn't any. That's actually the power of Kubernetes. If you have a CI/CD system that's built to deliver apps on Kubernetes, or you have monitoring set up, or you have any other best practices or expertise built in your organization, you don't have to go learn any new tool. You get to use Kubernetes. You just use the same YAML specifications to deploy your applications. You just need to understand the context under which Windows applications are deployed and Linux apps. And if you're careful about that, then you understand some of the limitations or some of the gotchas between the two ecosystems, then you get to go business as usual. You build your app into a Windows container using some of the best practices that Microsoft and Docker have provided, and then give Kubernetes the YAML specification, and boom, you're up and running in a matter of seconds, and you get to utilize all the power of Kubernetes, from the high availability, the restartability, the health checks, the logging, all of that good stuff that you get from Kubernetes just come to you for free. So that is a tremendous power. But by the way, I also want to introduce a couple of new members that came on our chat. We have Deep from Docker and Adelina from Cloudbase as well. Thank you all for attending. They're both have made tremendous contributions to our SIG as well.
So I guess in the past, before this feature, how did people kind of kludge around this? They just had a Windows cluster and a Kubernetes cluster, and then you just ended up with maintaining double the masters that you think you should have?
I wouldn't say it's so much like double the masters. It was like when we started developing the container feature, like almost right out of the gate, we had support for Docker Swarm, and there's a lot of customers actually running in production on that today. And then there's also been a team that's been developing support around Mesos. I don't know what the exact support is there, but we've basically been showing that because we've got that building block, which is the container, it can run in different ecosystems. And since there was a critical mass of enough people that wanted to be able to use Kubernetes across both Windows and Linux, that's why we sort of picked up and did that too. If you want, I can share Windows showing just a little bit about the admin experience if you want to see that.
Absolutely, I think that'd be great.
Okay. Okay, so what I have here is I'm actually connected over to one of my. This happens to be a Linux VM. But within here, I've already built a cluster up yesterday afternoon, but I've got 4 different nodes in there. 2 of them happen to be running Windows Server Data Center. 2 of them are running Ubuntu 16.04, and even though I'm connected from Linux, since it's the Kubernetes API, the same tools, kube control, are still working. So if we look at all the stuff that's running in Kube system, all the key things like API server, controller manager, all that's still running over on the Linux nodes. But then if I want to go ahead and run not a Windows workload, let me kick off that deployment. But all the syntax is pretty much the same here. The main difference is just that the image that I'm actually deploying is one that was built based on a Microsoft Windows Server, and this is using the one of the inbox roles, Internet Information Server, which is just the web server in Windows. And so really simple YAML, just starting one container, opening port 80, and then mapping a load balancer service on that. So then when I look at the deployments, that's all the same. and we've got that running. Service is running, so then if I do curl,
I noticed the Iis Load Balancer. Coming from a Linux world, is that just analogous to an Nginx style?
well, I guess that's sort of misnamed. This is the Iis service. The type is load balancer, but because I'm running this on Azure, it's actually configured an Azure load balancer here.
Okay.
And so if I wanted to set up ingress using Nginx, I could do that and just run Nginx on one of the Windows nodes and use that as the controller here. Yeah, so like if I scale that up, I'm still using the same load balancer service there, but if I go and look at the actual pods, I've got multiple instances starting up there.
Yep, actually, the quality in the stream isn't as high when we're doing the live stream. Could you increase the font size a little bit? And for those of you asking, yes, this will be posted on YouTube, and usually the text comes out pretty much perfect there.
Yeah, let me see.
So we have a question in the chat room if this is going to be posted on somewhere later on.
Yeah, it's actually the same YouTube URL that you're watching right now.
Excellent.
Okay, how's that? Is that a little bit better?
Yeah, there's usually a delay, so
okay.
Hopefully it'll look better for him.
All right. But anyway, that's, actually deploying the workloads is exactly the same. And so all the same tooling that people are already familiar with, whether they're using kube control on, Linux, Mac OS, Windows, that tooling's all the same.
Mm-hmm.
And so the only thing that's really different from the Windows developer experience is, of course, how they're building the Windows containers, just because the application that they're running inside is a little bit different. So maybe they use Visual Studio and .NET Framework and then build and then run Docker build afterwards. There's plugins for doing that within like the traditional Visual Studio, and then of course there's also stuff there in like Visual Studio Code as well. So it's really kind of up. It's really kind of up to the user for what their preference is in the tooling there. There's not any one thing that's required that's substantially different.
Mm-hmm. So on my code setup, I would just be using the normal plugins that I do, right? Because it's just the Kubernetes API, right?
Yeah.
And then we're also on top of that, a lot of our effort is going into bringing all the same CNI providers that are available on Linux, also on Windows. So you're seeing Flannel Host Gateway is available already as a GA feature. We have Flannel VXLAN, that's a beta feature. We're working with folks from some of the other commercialized CNI providers to also bring them on Windows. We have the OVN Kubernetes that the folks at Cloudbase, which are a big part of our community, that they have developed. So we're doing a lot of work across the board to make sure that you have a good selection of CNI providers that give you a single networking control plane across your Linux and your Windows ecosystem.
Okay. More questions. Somebody has feedback. I think that's
Hey, Deeb, I think it's coming from you.
If you can mute, that'd be great. There we go. So how does networking and storage actually work, like across clouds? Like, could I replicate Patrick's setup on like either AWS or GCP manually, or is it?
There are certain CNIs that don't work across the board. There's a Azure CNI that's specifically really tied to Azure, but if you're using Flannel, for example, or any of the other WindBridge or CNIs, then you could definitely can replicate your environment. I mean, the key thing here is that most of the content of your environment is your apps, right? Your YAML specs, your containers. And if those are available across any cloud, whether that's through a private registry or a public registry, then your choice of networking, as long as the capabilities are the same, shouldn't really matter that much. But yeah, most of our CNI providers are available throughout the board. Same thing for storage. So we don't have the same storage integration that exists for Linux, but we're working on that. But anything you choose will, like flex volumes, it will be available throughout any cloud environment you have deployed.
Yeah, like statically provisioned storage should be available through SMB and iSCSI using flex volume. And CSI is something we're working on with SIG storage to see what we can do.
Yeah, and then also, we've had some folks from Google and SIG Windows that have been working on Google persistent disk support as well. So like if you go and look at our test grid, we're already running tests across multiple clouds right now, Azure and GCE. So.
And what does on-prem look like?
So right now for on-prem, there's two different network plugins that are already working. One of them is Open Virtual Networking, and that's using the Open Virtual Switch underneath. If you got more questions around that, I think Alan was in the channel. He's been working on that. And then we've also got support for Flannel, and that's part of what Kalia's team has been working on. Do you want to talk more about that, Kalia?
Yeah, what specifically should I talk about there?
Kalia, we do have a question around if any of our Windows CNI options will support network policy API, and that's from Jason from Rancher.
Okay. Oh, I can't see that picture that he posted, but oh no, that's separate. Okay. Currently, right now, there are no plans that we have to support network policy API because I think right now we would have to use the analogous Windows network policies to support that. But if there is a need, if there's a specific need, you can talk to me and then we can go over that. But currently there are no plans because we haven't had too many customers ask for it yet.
I guess we can bring it back to Jason. Is there a specific need why you're asking for this? Is there a customer scenario or a potential need within Rancher that you're looking for network policies?
Yeah, there'll be a bit of delay while he responds. So we have 76 people watching right now, but not a lot of questions. So feel free, those of you that are listening in, you can join the Slack by following the instructions below. And just feel free to just ask your question and we'll read it on the air. I see some people typing furiously, so we'll give them some time to ask their questions. And
also, if anybody has a couple of minutes, they can fill that poll that I posted earlier. If you scroll up just a little bit in the Slack channel, we'll go through that and kind of talk about some of the items. If someone doesn't want to ask a question directly after the poll, it will be completely anonymous.
Yep, so he's asking, we're getting questions around it because early POCs around the Calico/Windows. And it looks like he's still typing more clarifications.
Oh, there is work being done for Calico and for Windows, but I didn't work on that particular project, so I can't speak to it. But if you follow up with me offline, then I can answer that question at a different time.
Kalia, I think if you can find the answer and post it to the Slack channel later on, I think that probably will be beneficial to other folks as well.
Yeah, I'll get someone on the Slack channel who is working on Calico.
Okay. Listeners, any other questions? While we get questions, what else do we want to talk about?
So I think like one interesting thing we worked on in 114 on the identity side was bringing in GMSA support. So the idea there was in the typical Windows enterprise scenario, you have this concept of Active Directory and identities associated with your workloads. So that, as Patrick was showing, you may have an IIS that says, hey, only if you have a certain identity from Active Directory associated with, say, an app running in that IIS, it can go and authenticate against a database, right? SQL Server database in the backend. So one of the things we prototyped as an alpha in 1.14 was bringing in that support to Kubernetes containers and workloads. So some of the inner plumbings of that was already present through the Docker engine and through the HCS subsystem below. And what we did was bring up that support, like surface it up into the Kubernetes layer. Initially through annotations, where you can create these GMSA identities in the cluster as custom resources, and then associate them with your, say Iis workloads if you want to.
Okay, looks like we got some comments in chat. Craig, if you could mute, that would be great. Sinclairinator asks, have you gotten a lot of feedback on use of GMSA for Windows containers on K8s? Which is what you were just talking about. Anything to add there?
Sorry, what was the question?
It sounds like he was asking exactly what you were talking about. Sinclair, if you can ask, if you have a specific follow-up question, let us know if his little overview there answered your question. And then BMO asks, question, what are recommendations for Hyper-V versus native containers? I heard security is a major reason Hyper-V is recommended, but what are the security implementations and risks of native containers?
Patrick, that's all yours. Answer to Ben.
Okay. Yeah, I can talk about that. So today the default way that everything is running is what if you've used Docker on Windows, we basically have two different levels of isolation that we refer to as process and Hyper-V. And so today we're using the process-based isolation. And so much like Linux, this is using a shared kernel across all the containers that are running there. And so there's a couple things that are different in that, like on Linux, things like there's a lot of things like user IDs and group IDs that are well known. And so that's why you've got efforts to do things like set pod security policies for like run as non-root and things like that, which are sort of designed to, in the case where someone can break out of the container out of the container runtime, would they have privileges on the host? And so on Linux, there's been a set of practices, and people are, gradually trying to build processes around, policies around that, so that they can restrict what can and cannot be done. In the Windows case, it's a little bit different because each container actually has its own security database, and so there's no equivalent of something like etc groups or etc password that are shared across all the individual containers. So the users are always separated by default, and so it's a little bit different and arguably a little bit more secure because the users aren't inherently shared between the host and the containers. But if we've got customers that are running, untrusted code, and they basically want 2 layers of protection against breakout attacks, then that's where being able to use the Hyper-V isolation is something that is something that you may want to do there. The other thing that's going to be really important about Hyper-V is that that's also what we're going to be using to build support for forward compatibility. And what I mean by that is, if you build a container that runs and depends on Windows Server 2019 today, when you go and update a node to a new version of Windows, next one coming out is going to be 1903, although I think that might be misnamed, but then one of the differences between Windows and Linux is that in Windows, the user mode needs to be paired with the same kernel mode version. And so in order to get that compatibility on that newer node, using Hyper-V isolation means that it can still provide that container the matching kernel version, so you don't have any compatibility problems between there. So that way you're free to upgrade the nodes faster than you rebuild the containers, so that that way as we get new features developed to support new network features and other enhancements like that, you'll be able to take advantage of those without having to rebuild the containers. So that's the other big use case for Hyper-V that we're going to be working to enable in probably version 15. It's something that we're discussing right now with SIG Node and trying to get some alignment around runtime classes for that. So that way there's a very clear way in the Kubernetes API that you can choose what level of isolation you want when you actually do a deployment. So that way that'll be consistent, with what people are doing with like Kata and some of the other efforts.
Okay, Ben, I hope that answers your question. Feel free to post a follow-up if you'd like any clarification on any of that. We're about halfway through. Those of you that have joined us midstream, feel free to join us on Slack below and ask your question. The next question comes from Carlos. He says, what's the recommended network provider plugin to use with Windows nodes running on Azure?
Sure, I could take that one. So Azure CNI is the one that we're doing the most testing with today. And like the tool that I use to deploy that cluster is called AKS Engine. And for Windows, it should be using that by default. And so that's the one that I'd recommend using there. That also lets you, basically the way it allocates all the IPs, if you want to be able to do things like apply Azure-based network policies through the network security groups, or do additional routing through like a VPN peering or site-to-site and things like that, because it's using an Azure IP, you can do some of that stuff as well.
Okay, any other comments on this feature from anyone else on the panel before we move on to the next question? All right, let's see. Next question is from Alan. He goes, follow-up question on the Hyper-V containers. Will Windows Sandbox be integrated with Kubernetes?
Okay, so I'm trying to remember what Windows Sandbox is. If it's the one that's used for running desktop applications, it does share some of the same technology that we use underneath for for the Docker-based containers, but it's something that's fundamentally a bit different, because the goal of Windows Sandbox is that it's supposed to be able to isolate the application from the rest of the system, but things like the version and some of the stuff that's on your system is supposed to bleed through and be visible to it. Whereas in the containers, when we're running Docker-based containers, the goal is that you can't tell what host you're running on. It runs the same everywhere. And so it's a little bit of a different goal. The Windows Sandbox is more about providing desktop level isolation, and there's no programmatic interface like Docker around it. So although it may share some of the same technology underneath, the goal is not to use Kubernetes to deploy UI-based apps. The goal is to use Kubernetes to deploy server-based apps.
Okay, next question comes from Ben. Keep them coming, everyone. Are there any infrastructure as a service vendors planning to support Windows nodes in their offerings anytime soon? AKS, GKE, etc. I don't know.
So I'll let Patrick answer the Azure question. I guess from the Google Next conference, Google has announced a private preview of Windows containers in GKE. So you can assume that most of the other public vendors will kind of follow suit within their own timelines. We don't have anything that we can publicize. But Patrick, you want to answer about Azure as well?
Yeah, so for Azure, we've got an open source project called AKS Engine. That's what we're actually using to run all the tests on the Kubernetes master branch. And so you can use that today and build up your own cluster with whatever kind of options you want. And then there's also a sign up list for the AKS preview. And so that's gradually rolling out right now, but I can't like you can get on the list, but I can't tell you exactly when you'll be able to start using it. So
some folks on marketing might have an issue with that if you give a date.
Yep, I can't give a date, but
yeah. And has anyone else announced recently that we know of?
I think that's it. It's just Google and it looks like Azure both have private signups that you can follow through to get access, but nothing public yet.
Well, and then Huawei also has one going in the China market.
Good to know. All right, David has a question. It says, have you all already discussed the Windows equivalent to IP tables? I don't know if you have a specific question there, or you just want a overview of how you would do a firewall on the node. I'm not sure.
Well, I can give a quick intro on that. So
yeah, that'd be great.
Calio would know a little bit more on that. So a lot of the plugins on Linux use IP tables to basically reroute and rewrite traffic. And Windows has a similar thing called the virtual filtering platform. And that's part of the team that Calio works on. But basically, when we write a Windows CNI plugin, VFP provides the underlying functionality that's able to do that. Do you want to elaborate on that at all, Kalia?
Yeah, so VFP is responsible for a lot of things like natting is a big one, ACLs. It's responsible for load balancing. So HNS is a service that runs whenever you have containers on Windows, and it's responsible basically for programming VFP to control the packet flow. So it's rule-based. So as a user, you're not really concerned about the rules. You just need to know which HNS objects or policies to configure. Right now, kubeproxy is mostly responsible for those types of things. And then other network plugins like Calico and everything, they program HNS to subsequently program VFP. If there's a more specific use case, then I can speak more to that. But in general, that's the Windows equivalent.
Okay, David, if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to just type them. Moving on, Rico, you're next. Is it possible to deploy an ingress controller with Kubernetes Windows? We glossed about this earlier. But if you could give us more detail on ingress controllers in this environment.
Yeah, I could talk a little bit about that. So, I believe that you could, because we still have kubeproxy running on the Windows nodes, and so that means that any individual node can route Kubernetes services, but you're not required to run the ingress controller on Windows. So like I did a presentation at KubeCon in December, and in that one, I had I don't know, I think it was something like 40 people in the room, all deploying Windows apps, and I just used a high availability Nginx cluster there, running on the Linux nodes, and then that worked fine. So I was able to start from a known good setup on the Linux side, and because all those Windows nodes could provide services using normal service IPs, I could still route all that traffic in there. And so, with just the one domain name and public IP, I had, I don't know, 40, 50 different services all routing through that. So there's nothing substantially different there. But if you wanted to, try running something directly on Windows, I know that there's an open source Nginx port, and I think traffic might be able to function as an ingress controller as well, but I haven't specifically used it. Does anybody else have experience on that they can share? If not, maybe we can just follow up on the Slack channel later.
I don't know if Craig is trying to speak because he's, I think, went green. Nope. Yeah, we can probably follow up on the Slack channel. I don't have any specific data on that.
Okay, we'd love to hear it. Ben is asking, is there a plan to support Alcal and get rid of the need for Linux nodes entirely?
I think I sufficiently answered him in Slack by making fun of him. Yeah, I think the need here is really going to come from the customers. We just went GA right now. We're going to hear customer feedback. We're going to see how customers and users are deploying Windows in Kubernetes, how they're using it, and kind of use that feedback to prioritize our next set of features. And if this becomes a high priority for many users and it becomes a need, then we as a community are going to invest in it and make that a reality. But right now, no specific direct needs. That's not in our immediate roadmap based on the data that we have today.
Okay, and with that, we're caught up on questions. Nick would like to add that traffic is working for him. Thanks for that feedback. While we wait for more questions, this gives me a chance to, because we're starting to run out of time here. What are the plans for the next cycle and beyond? What current things have you heard so far that you're road mapping? You know, we don't need the details, just like the general, you know.
Yeah, absolutely. So, you know, Patrick and I and the community kind of huddled up a couple of weeks ago, and we did that for a couple of weeks in a row. And we talked about, you know, what's the next set of investments that we need to make. And Patrick kind of talked about that earlier. Containerd and the runtime class, the work that we need to support Hyper-V isolation, both for compatibility reasons, for the higher security isolation. Those are super important things for us because we will enable another set of class of apps that can run on Kubernetes on Windows. So those are super important. The group managed service accounts that Deep mentioned earlier is something that we want to continue graduating to the next stage in the Kubernetes evolution. So going from beta to eventually GA at some point. So we'll continuously invest into that work. We want to continue making our support more feature rich and getting closer to what the Linux equivalent has for containers, and continually fixing bugs, improving scale, reliability. So our work is not done, but those are some of our high value targets. The last one is, it looks like kubeadm is a chosen orchestrator for creating clusters in the community and from users everywhere. So our goal here is to provide full kubeadm support for Windows nodes with 1.15. Patrick, anything else to add, or Deep?
Yeah, like increased storage support. So that's one of the things we're working on. Yeah, making sure that you know, maybe through a privileged proxy, get CSI plugins working so that if they're based on Windows, on the Windows containers, and they adapt to the API exposed by the proxy, they can do the operations that are needed and still be packaged as containers.
Yeah, and then yeah, we're also doing the work around CRI Containerd, but one of the things that's important there is that we've had a number of people on the Windows container team contributing a lot of new code over to Containerd, and so there's a little bit more flexibility through that API, and so we want to unlock some of those capabilities through Kubernetes as well. And so I've got a plan that's shared with SIG Windows that outlines what some of the improvements are there, and so that one of the nice things about the CRI Containerd API is that, of course, since it implements CRI, it's much closer to the way Kubernetes works, and so it'll let us give a little bit more control over things like how memory and CPU work and things like that. So that's kind of another area of investment going forward. So that way, as new versions of Windows come out, it'll be easier for us to get new features implemented, because that development's being done lockstep between Containerd and Windows.
Yep, and it looks like Michael's actually posted a question to ask the group. But before we get to that, Michael, if you could plop in the link to your SIG meeting notes and how people can get involved.
Yeah,
great. Yeah,
absolutely. So not just SIG meeting notes. It's actually posted. It's pinned on the Slack channel as well.
Perfect.
I'll repost it. It's basically a getting started guide for Windows. Includes everything: documentation, contributor guides, our meeting notes, meeting schedule. I'll post it right now, and it's already pinned, folks.
Yeah, it looks like you folks have 15 pinned items, so that's good. Those of you that are joining new, we're expecting a bunch of new. That's why we're having a bunch of new users now, that this is a major new feature that people have been looking forward to. Just want to make sure that those of you on the stream and listening know how to find the information. How often do you all meet? Every week? Every other week?
Every week at 12:30 Eastern.
Okay. And like all the other SIGs, these meetings are open to the public. The notes are published and all that good stuff. So check out the pinned items in the Slack. If you want to know how to join the Slack, just put slack.kubernetes.io in your browser, follow the instructions, and join the SIG Windows channel. With that, Michael would like to ask, any impact to Windows with the CRI-O announcements from Red Hat now that CRI-O is hosted by the CNCF?
Hey, Patrick, that question was for you.
Okay. I mean, basically, if someone wants to do some CRI-O development on Windows, I'm perfectly okay with that. And so I think we just need to look and see if anybody steps up in the community and then starts working on it. The way that the kubelet can be configured, you could point to any API endpoint you want that implements CRI. And so like today we're using Docker shim, which is built into the kubelet, but with just a command line switch, we could switch over to CRI container D. And so, CRI-O would definitely be viable as well if there's someone that wants to invest in it. But the developers I'm working most closely with are working on CRI container D today at Microsoft. So, so I think it's just kind of a wait and see what the community wants to do with CRI-O.
Okay, Ben would like to ask, is there any work going on to support privileged containers on Windows?
At the moment, no. Because the level of isolation is completely different, we don't have the capability to let processes running in a container see resources on the host, like the physical drives and things like that. I think we may have some opportunities to do that with CRI container D and Hyper-V isolation, because we could, since you could basically start multiple containers in the same sandbox, we may be able to let some of those run privileged with some certain devices exposed there. But as for running directly on the Windows host, we don't have any plan for that. One thing that you can do, however, is if you want to be able to access certain endpoints that are available over the network over a named pipe. One example would be if you were writing a tool that you wanted to run as a daemon set that needed access to Docker or the CRI endpoint, then you could map that into a container and then run that there. Likewise, Windows does have a remote management protocol called WinRM that you can use to do things like storage management and other tasks. And so if you gave a container a certificate or a username and password and the IP address of the host, then it could connect around that way and do management actions on the host, much like you would do with something like SSH remoting. Of course, SSH is also available as an optional component on Windows Server if you want to run stuff there. So, if your goal is to use something like a daemon set to install software across a bunch of machines, then you could do that by basically doing a loop back and gain privilege through basically over the network using a network-based login.
Okay. Ben, I hope that answers your question. You feel free to ask a follow-up. We'll keep it open for questions for a few more minutes, but as we get into the outro here, are there any major features or anything that we haven't talked about yet that you feel should get some attention? Talked a little bit about networking, a little bit about storage. I see people typing in the channel, so let's see what people are talking about here.
By the way, also thank you to everyone that has completed the poll. That's giving us good insight into both use cases for running Windows containers, what's important to you. So this is really good feedback that we can use to help us prioritize some of our feature requests. And from the looks of it, the folks that have completed the poll are the ones that are more passionate about Windows, and it looks that it's both urgent and important to your organization to have Windows containers. So thank you for that, and we'll work very hard to continuously improving our support here.
Yeah, it looks like a lot of people showed up as well today. So this is something that we could do. We could run on a regular basis to for people to ask questions and give your team feedback there. So if you think this is pretty good, I would love to hear it, or any other feedback that you have on running these office hours like this. We also have general Kubernetes office hours the third Wednesday of every month if you're interested in that. So it looks like some people are typing. So let's do like a last call for questions then. Sinclairinator says, thank you for all your work on Windows containers and GMSA. It's been very useful. Awesome. Thanks for joining. All right. And with that, since we don't have any questions, we'll go ahead and wrap it up. Team, do you have any final thoughts or comments that you'd like to say?
Yeah, I'll basically say thank you for using, thank you for the support. If you guys are interested in contributing, we'd love to have you. We will accept all levels of contributions, from try things out and file a bug, or look at our documentation and find an area that you can improve, or make sure that you provide us feedback in an area that you want us to improve. Or if you're a Go developer and you want to try honing your development skills and get started in the Kubernetes community, we have a contributor guide that's posted through our Getting Started guide that you can read upon and see if you can fix some easy bugs. And we're a welcoming community. We love new members, and we'll help you get started.
All right, and we'll wrap this up. We'll likely do another one of these, so pay attention to the list and to the channel and the usual social places, and we will do announcements. And with that, panel, stick around for a little bit. And those of you on the stream, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.